and bring to the floor our next speaker, Chris Nesbitt Smith. Good morning, Chris. It is still morning, right? I'm losing track of time already.
Just about.
It's morning for you, but not morning for the rest of Europe. Come on, you're the last one.
It's fine. We're the ones that define the time, though, so we'll set it on our own basis.
Fair point. Fair point.
Right, let's move things along here. So I'm going to add your slides to the stream here, Chris. Hopefully, press the button. There we go. Brilliant. Cool. So the floor is yours.
Amazing. Yeah. What better setup? Thank you very much. Cool. So. This is I think it's great to be here. Thank you so much for joining me here today. So, elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sound sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So, bear with me. So, to set the scene, I'm in a lift, and yes, any American friends, we really do call them lifts, and 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment now or never. As the doors close, I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I hear the doors still shut behind me as I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important. I gesture to her, see? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods. Oh, perfect. The CIO, the policy maker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? Well, I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? Well, she tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing, what's the volume of risk, and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing the policy is slow, hard to communicate, and people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do, but then I'm left playing catch-up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, try not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, but look less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be weird if I was wrong here. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker. I say, well, what's important to you? So managing risk, mostly opportunity risk. So the fear of missing out. So getting features out of the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, as they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that is almost designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO, but before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, I say. Oh, okay, hold. How did you get into my imagination? I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person, hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write, I ask? It doesn't really matter, but Python. Have you got everything updated to work with? As I pause, Python 3, they say? Python 3, yeah, that must be really hard. They don't know it, but I've kind of informally won a bit of their trust, which is, after all, important. Nearly, they say. Cool. Okay, well, what's important to you? So staying on top of patching dependencies so that we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, and what I could break, and what ultimately might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code and avoiding technical debt, so the rest of my team being able to cohesively work as one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Well, yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the kind of usual. Great, I say. I wrote code too. Let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code and say, here's my public GPG key, so you know that you can trust what I have to say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and then when it changes? Well, we get a memo or something stuck to the notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. How does that work out? Well, it's up to us to then maintain the to-do list so that we can onboard new people. Does it go wrong at all? Well, yes, sometimes if we compile our operational manual wrong, we miss a memo, don't apply them in sequence, we do get things wrong. So they glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I look to the dev. Does that sound familiar? They nod. Turns out we're not all special snowflakes, hey? All is not lost. I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great. I've got a silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way, so to stop obstructing my answer, well, I don't actually work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs. The door's shut. I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of this might sound vaguely familiar to you, then, and you can relate to some of my imaginary friends, then I've got answers for you. So what if I said you could update policy easily, even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month? What about 10 updates in a single day? And seamlessly communicate those to the people that need to consume it, all without derailing them. You could have visibility on compliance using tools that you perhaps already use, and that the policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, and make sense, not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to, and ultimately not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally and in CI, and then onwards kind of guard production. Multiple versions of a policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's now some known vulnerability type updates become a business as usual activity in order to communicate to those that need to know. Sound interesting? Okay, hang around. So I've hopefully at least got some of your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt Smith. I'm currently an instructor for Learn K8 and also Control Plane, consultant currently to the Crown Prosecution Service, and a tinkerer of open source stuff in this sort of space. I spent a fair chunk of my professional career now working in UK government and large organisations where problems like these are rife. We should hopefully have some time at the end for questions. If not, you can probably find me on LinkedIn somewhere. So, given I've got the luxury of a live audience, albeit you're kind of away somewhere, I wonder if you could put in the comments who's with my CIO and has set, written, or applied some policy before. So just leave a comment and say that you're a policy maker if you've set or applied any sort of policy before. So if that is like, let's say, setting some coding standards for your team, or saying that, I don't know, something needs to be encrypted, or whatever it might be, any sort of policy that you defined, if you could just leave a comment of saying that you're a policy maker. Cool. I'll catch up on where everyone's at late in a bit. Okay, so you can next round. So now, if you've sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with at least some good intentions, could you leave a comment of policy breaker? Just leave a comment of policy breaker so I can kind of get a feel for the sort of divide in the room. Cool. Okay, well, if you have, you fell for it. Thanks to the organisers of this event, we've got all your names and your employer's details all recorded. So lend me your ears. The stakes just got raised. So where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? So it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, so tabs 2 or 4 space indentated maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in proportionate control, which there becomes the open doors to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come against situations that you weren't anticipating. So this is not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex to navigate rulebook and then harder still to measure compliance. It often can look like the thin bit of a wedge where the precedent may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous with others looking to expand upon its scope, which can lead us to then sometimes wonder if the cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not at least how we typically develop software. So why does this all have to be so hard? Surely there must be a better answer. Well, we codified everything else. So isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we typically do it wrong. So maybe some of you are screaming your favorite product name at me in your heads as the solution, and I don't think you're wholly wrong. However, the devil's in the detail. Throwing some curly braces or YAML something doesn't actually inherently fix things. So if it's a security control, it's often tempting to just keep that policy a secret. Exposing it could be used against you by an adversary. However, that does not support us in shifting left. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. Therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see in the scenario of an application deploy, midway through finding one resource is non-compliant and rejected could leave the overall deploy in an inconsistent halfway state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was that policy better than the downtime? Especially if it leads your engineers, who are all hopefully plenty smart people, finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they've got. This then becomes further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong. So you form that case law and you need to apply a new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say that you provide warnings on at least the less important or new emerging policy, which is great, so long as someone sees them. So, but if you adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD, is anyone actually seeing those warnings? I mean, who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest that you're probably missing the point of CI/CD. You should be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not here just to throw stones today. So if we remember my implied promises to my 4 imaginary friends of what this future kind of promised land might look like, well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved most, if not all, of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and then join the dots. So, well, the first is something that if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not be doing, however, is then making that visible. So at least in a source set, by which I mean allow your walled garden of employees, suppliers, etc., to be able to see the policy. I'm not saying give away all your threat monitoring and intel away. You can probably keep all of that to yourself. But I'd argue that the visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime and reverse engineered workarounds and opaque legacy exemption spaghetti soup. So if you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find that it unlocks and abilities work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and then often only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now to those that need to see it. So many of you, and no doubt you're used to semantic version, but a quick recap in context to this. So the first segment is to indicate break, perhaps conflicting changes. In the context of policy, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not really judging. And increments of that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than just free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes. So these shouldn't break anyone. And increments of that might look like correcting a spelling mistake on the department name. The third segment is to indicate patch changes. So these should be a no-brainer for anyone to keep up to date with. And increments of that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repo, its version. We can easily communicate the policy. We can tack on release notes, and expectations are all being managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just yet another dependency? You might unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, so it's visible in a repo, its version. We can easily communicate it. We can tack on the release notes. Expectations are all set by Assembler. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know testing is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend upon, it's also provide known good examples. Tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface potential side effects before they can then hurt everyone involved. So consumers of this policy can then test themselves against their policy locally and then in the CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback and loop and better informing them. So as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependabot or Men's Renovate to do this for us. So think automatic pull requests, tests, even auto merging if you like. Okay, so to check everyone is all still awake, can anyone leave me a comment and tell me a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? As you know, all presentations this year are contractually required to reference log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes. So in just a few short months, I can remove these and hopefully just point broadly at a list of scary-looking CVEs in order to command your behavior through fear. What I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around the software supply chain is something that your organization is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can then lead us to allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing. And this is not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. It's time to look at actually how you might be able to do this. And I know you all really came here wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! But to maintain scope, I'm going to be talking about two things to prove that it's not just one tech or one tool. So I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy to really invent much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could use any, some, or even all. So Chetkov will be doing my Terraform and Caverno will be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization here. I'm not expecting you necessarily to read or grok the code on screen. Don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that it's a real thing. So the policy is stored here in this repo. So here's where my policy starts at v1.00. So I've got policy that requires a department label on all resources. So long as it's set, doesn't actually matter what it is. I've written tests for this. So note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example about what and bad looks like. We pushed a tag in Git. We've added release notes. I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which of course it does. But moving on. Version 2 looks similar, only now that department field has to be from a predetermined list. So, like before, tests exist, release notes are written, tags are signed. 210 is where we notice and correct a spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of departments. 211, and I've now added a new department to the list. App1, so a few more repos in that organization. So App1 and Infra1, well, they depend on version 1.0 of the policy, and it's not compliant with version 2 or beyond. But how do I know this? So I configured Renovate in this case to be automatically make me a pull request. And when there's a new version of the policy, it's super obvious. So if I can update my dependency, and I can also see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over the org. So I could use this to measure compliance of my policy. Okay, moving on. So App2, a couple more repos, App2 and Infra2, well, they depend on version 2.00 of the policy. But however, I could merge the open, excuse me, the open pull request all the way up to 211. Sorry, cold. Finally, App3 and Infra3 are dependent on 211, and they get a gold star from the CIO. Okay, there is a small touch of magic to this, and it's not pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I probably will have definitely written worse. So what this does is allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. So ideally, this might be less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the policy to be accepted and evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. Kubernetes gives you admission controllers, so it's not so easy to get the same policy evaluation in cloud. They've got their own kind of policy code and in execution environments. I've not figured out how to evaluate that code locally. Again, pull requests and contribution, collaboration, all very welcome. So you may have noticed the way that I wrote the policy. It's designed and distributed. It lends itself well to coexist with itself in a Kubernetes cluster, which brings us to a few more repos. So there's cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all the versions that we've described so far. Likewise, cluster 2 only accepts 2.00 and greater. So we can automate all of this using Kind for CI to deploy the apps. And then we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant, policy, all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on. So this is great. But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story about why it exists? After all, if your agile team is even half effective, it will reject anything it perceives as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. It could allow our devs to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions with risks that inform mitigations, manifested as policy, all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policy can move with it. When some new privacy regulation comes out, say, or your latest marketing strategy pays off, or you acquire more data, for example, even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite will stand still for no one. So we can liken this to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, change is hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it first time, which can lead us to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to the risks that are more tangibly real in the now. So that's where the real culture change is needed. And the execution of that is a long series of talks in of itself. So now this is all really over to you. Honestly, the best thing you could do right now is tell me that it's madness, already done, irrelevant, or otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber peers have yet to do. So beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building more case studies with willing organizations and allow me to swap out some of my imaginary friends for real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together is, and feel free to say this out loud with me, that purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy, which I've been practicing saying far too many times. So I've been Chris Nesbitt Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to leave. I will destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier, maybe. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, and you can be rest assured that there'll be no spam or much content at all, since I'm awful at any sort of self-promotion, especially on social media. So cns.me actually just points to my LinkedIn. Talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and they're all open source. And I've probably definitely run over. Sorry.
Thanks,
okay,
Chris.
No worries.
You win the prize for today's most slides in a single presentation award.
I mean, we
don't have time for any questions on this one, I'm afraid. But if you want to hang out in the Discord, Chris, I'm sure there's some folks who might want to have further discussions about this, because there's been a lot of folks saying they've really enjoyed it.
Cool.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris.